My name is Dhananjay Nanda. I'm professor of accounting at Miami Herbert Business School, also the Vice Dean of Faculty and Research. And today I'm presenting my thoughts on ESG and accounting. I was invited by Jan Bones and Peter Easton as organizers. And so these are my thoughts. I guess you'd characterize them as something which would be heterodox. So when I started thinking about what I'm going to talk about, I said, we're sitting here in 2023, mid-23. What was said 5 years ago about where we'll be today? So I went back and I found this, which is a tweet of a quote by a top climate scientist that says, climate change will wipe out all of humanity unless we stop using fossil fuels over the next 5 years. Well, here we are 5 years later. We are using more fossil fuels than ever, and we are doing just fine. So what does this mean? This means most forecasts are uncertain, okay? And this has implications for how accountants, as social scientists, think about the ESG movement, which has a lot of forecasts in it. So I'm going to give you my perspective. Now, my perspective is colored by my views, and I'm not an earth scientist or a climate scientist. So I actually read this book over the last few months by Steve Koonin called Unsettled, which is a response to the quote oftentimes we hear from people that the science is settled. Well, Steve makes a very, very good argument for why the science is really not settled and why what we learn from media and from policy and regulatory bodies is often mistaken about the true science. But I'm not going to talk about climate science. I'm going to talk about accounting and how ESG operates. But before I get there, I want to tell you two stories from my own personal history, which sort of have guided my thinking on the subject. The first story has to do with this gentleman called Robert McNamara. Robert McNamara was a whiz kid. So in the late 50s, he worked for Ford Motor Company, and he brought what was called systems analysis to developing automobiles or building cars. He became famous because he was widely considered one of the smartest people around, and JFK hired him as the defense secretary, and he was the longest serving defense secretary in US history from 61 through the Kennedy administration and the Lyndon Johnson administration. This was also the time of the Vietnam War. What he brought to the administration was the systems analysis, which introduced metrics so that objectives of the government were achieved. So in the 60s, the biggest objective for the government was the fight against communism. And it was pitched as the only way the world can be saved is if we defeat communism. Now, what this led to was we were coming out of the Korean War, and the next threat was Vietnam, where the North Vietnamese were the communist threat to South Vietnam, which led to the Vietnam War. And Robert McNamara was a big proponent. And as late as 1966, when the US was clearly not winning, he claimed the US was winning. Now, where did that claim come from? It came from the systems analysis, which had introduced metrics in evaluating how the war was progressing. So one of the metrics that was introduced early in the war was this notion about how many Viet Cong can we kill. And each US military division was given a quota on how many they could kill. They had targets to meet. And all the pictures that were coming back to the Pentagon were very rosy. And the rosy was because some of the numbers were made up. Others managed the metric by indiscriminately killing innocent people. Now, none of this was verifiable because the war was fought in jungles, and when you killed the enemy, they buried the enemy, and you could not verify this information. Now, they realized that these reports were sounding rosy, and by 1967, they had some misgivings, which led them to the next system that they came up with is bombing. So they rolled out Operation Rolling Thunder. And Operation Rolling Thunder was where the US Air Force, they were evaluated based on metrics related to the number of sorties they flew and the number of bombs they dropped. So for the next 2 years, the US dropped more bombs in Vietnam than in all of the Second World War. Now, they thought that this would cause winning, except a lot of the pilots would fly and they would drop their bombs in the jungle. That counted for sorties and they counted for bombs, but the bombs were really ineffective. Again, this focus on metrics. Okay, I'm going to come back to this because this is a recurring theme in ESG, which is this focus on metrics and how we evaluate performance. The next story I'm going to tell you about is about a gentleman called Paul Ehrlich. Paul Ehrlich is a famous guy. He's a Stanford professor. He's also widely thought as one of the fathers of the environmental movement, as he's an ecologist and a biologist. He won the MacArthur Genius Award, inducted in the Royal Society in England, won the Crufoord Prize in Sweden. He's won all kinds of accolades. He's now emeritus at Stanford. In '68, he published a famous book. The book was called The Population Bomb. And the population bomb argued that the biggest threat to humanity was overpopulation. And he predicted, even in '68, in 1970, there'll be widespread famines. He advocated that the optimal population of the world should be 1.5 billion. Here we are at 8 billion. Quote, "We must rapidly bring the world population under control, reducing the growth rate to zero or making it negative." He advocated that we need to deter people from having children by taxing children, taxing childcare, and creating economic incentives to reduce birth rates. He also claimed India should be denied food aid because they are producing too many children. Okay, now, this is the time I was born in 1965, and India had a population of roughly 650 million at that time. And of course, it was the second largest population. Now, this had a huge impact on society. And one of the people this influenced was Robert McNamara again. Because McNamara, after the Vietnam War, he resigned as defense secretary and took over as the president of the World Bank. Now, at the World Bank, he embarked on what was called a poverty reduction program. That is, we have to save humanity, we should eliminate poverty. This is on the heels of Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty. Now, what was poverty reduction? Since the World Bank provides financial aid to developing countries, he tied aid to birth control, inspired by Paul Ehrlich's population bomb, that to eliminate poverty, we should reduce the number of people who are living in the world. Okay. Everybody loved this. The media had glowing recommendations. The Ford and Rockefeller Foundations funded the program. Now, this is a noble goal, reducing poverty, right? He came up with metrics on how countries should go about reducing birth control. One of the countries affected was India, and I was 10 years old when India declared the state of emergency, where the constitution was suspended. And the government of India embarked on this forced sterilization program, where people were apprehended and forcibly sterilized so that they could not have children. Over 8 million people were sterilized. Okay? Each state government was given a quota, and they would track these metrics because Lyndon Johnson had claimed that the US would not support anything in India until they brought their birth control down. Again, the focus was on metrics. And McNamara's conclusion was, at long last, India is moving to effectively address its population problem. Okay. Now, given this backdrop, see where we are. Let's assess. So when I was born, there were 650 million people living in India. The life expectancy was 44. Okay. Today, there are 1.4 billion, more than twice as many people. The life expectancy in India is 70. So in a little over half a century, we have gained a quarter of a century in life expectancy. India is wealthier than it ever was. So even though we were faced with this metrics of birth control, India is more prosperous because there are more people. Okay. So given this background and the fact that I grew up in India, how I think about how accounting academics should think about ESG. Okay, so I'm going to lay out a bunch of ideas that are central to accounting, the way we study it, the way we teach it. Okay, and I'm going to go through each one of these as they apply to ESG. So I'm going to start with the first thing, which is cost. What is cost? Okay, so this is when I teach managerial accounting, the first thing that we talk about in class is cost. So going back to 1931, this is J.R. Commons. J.R. Commons noted that all costs are transactions costs. So if there's oil lying in the ground, it's not costing anything. The cost is associated with extraction. So that is a human action of extraction creates costs, which means for a cost to exist, human action is necessary. Without any human action, there's no cost. Okay. This influences economics in many ways. So for instance, the whole notion of cost-benefit analysis is based on this notion that all actions are rational if benefit exceeds transaction cost. Okay. Now, what is the benefit? The benefit is a counterparty's transaction cost. So once I extract the oil and I sell it to a refiner, what the refiner pays me becomes my benefit. But what the refiner pays becomes the transaction cost of acquiring the extracted oil to refine it. Now, this influences accounting, because in accounting, how we record things is we look at measured transactions. So once two parties have transacted, that's a cost and a benefit that is recorded. Counterparties are absolutely essential. Without counterparties, we can't record a transaction because there's no transaction. Okay, so how does this apply to ESG? We don't have counterparties. Okay, so if you think about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, a company can reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, but who's the counterparty? Okay, if there's no counterparty, there's no transaction. What's the benefit? Because there's no counterparty, there's no benefit, because nobody's paying you to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, second, if there's no benefit, how can we measure things? And if we can't measure things, how can we verify them? These are some of the central ideas behind how we think about accounting, which ESG accounting just not able to help. Okay. Now, to do cost-benefit analysis, especially when our decisions have multi-period consequences, we need opportunity costs, and in multi-period terms, discount rates, which are the opportunity costs of investment. So one way to kind of think of cost-benefit analysis, and this is a quote from Don Boudreau at George Mason in a comment he made, which specifies in the context of CO2 emissions, how should we think about cost-benefit? Okay, so he claims that if we want to reduce emissions by X and the cost is Y, then humanity should spend Y to reduce emissions by X, if and only if, one, the value of reducing emissions by X is worth at least the value to us of what we would otherwise have enjoyed had we not spent Y to achieve this reduction, which is the opportunity cost. The second, and the improvement in our lives that would be achieved by that reduction cannot be achieved in some alternative way at a cost of less than Y, which means we have to list out the entire vector of alternatives to that reduction of X, of CO2, that would not achieve the same goals. So how does this apply in the ESG context? So if we do believe that reducing greenhouse gas emissions is noble, we need to quantify what are we giving up by spending that money. So if I spend trillions of dollars in reducing emissions, could I instead spend it on investment, which creates economic growth and prosperity, which would make humanity better off than just reducing greenhouse gas emissions? What are the alternatives? Because remember, we need to have the whole vector of alternatives. So it's not so much just reducing your emissions. Can we choose other technologies like nuclear, geoengineering? The third thing is, what are the alternatives available to humanity? Adaptation. So when I moved to Miami, which is much warmer than where I moved from, North Carolina, I adapted by giving up my woolen clothes and bought light clothing because Miami is warmer. Now, human beings have always adapted. In fact, I went to college in Bombay, which is now called Mumbai, where most of the city is built on reclaimed land from the sea. Bombay is doing just fine. We adapt. Now, so when we do a cost-benefit analysis of, say, let's say, emission reduction or greenhouse gas emission reduction, we need to list out what other available methods are there for individuals, for humanity. Okay. The second aspect is, since the consequences of these decisions are multi-period, we have uncertainty in the future, which requires us to have appropriate discount rates which reflect the opportunity cost of investment or the volatility in investment and benefits of investment going into the future. Now, let's say if you look at the UN and IPCC reports, they look at sort of climate change over a 100-year period. Now, with a 2%, a very modest 2% economic growth rate in the world, this implies in 100 years, humanity is going to be 7 to 8 times wealthier. Okay? So, if I say there's no discount rate, zero, which is not right, you could say yes. But then you are evaluating the benefits 100 years from now equal to the cost spent now, which is not right. It has to do with the uncertainty of the costs and benefits over time. And so if we use even nominal growth rates or discount rates of 10%, we end up with a 7 to 8 time wealth growth, and a 5% of GDP loss is really rounding error in there. So the question is, if I do a simple, what we do in accounting class, a capital budgeting problem, do we get the same answer as what the policy people are reflecting? Another central aspect in accounting is measurement. What is measurement? The first is, for measuring something, we need an underlying construct. What are we measuring? Okay. Then, how does what we are measuring relate to what we want to measure? Which is, we need a model. What's the error in measurement? And is measurement verifiable? Okay. So, ESG measures fail these tests. If you look at carbon, and I'll come back to scope 1, 2, and 3, what is the underlying construct relating greenhouse gas emissions to reduction in temperatures 100 years from now? There's lots of uncertainty over here. Okay? There's a lot of measurement error. Are these measures verifiable? It's not clear. Similarly with diversity or social measures. I'll come back to this and give you an example of this. Or governance. How does board composition affect social well-being? Social well-being is a good construct, but does it matter whether we have 2 women on a board versus 4 women on the board? How is social well-being affected? Now, I'll give you an example, and this has to do with the S part of the ESG. And if you look, some of the measures in the S part are what they call diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI measures. Most of them are measuring demographic diversity, which is female participation on boards, female CEOs, and so on. Well, now we find out that these are really uncorrelated with performance. Okay, so I recently came across an an article by Edmonds, Flammer, and Glossner. And what they claim is that their proprietary measure, which is employee satisfaction, is uncorrelated or negatively correlated with these DI measures. Okay. So the next aspect of, I'm going to talk a little bit about responsibility accounting, which is the separation of ownership and control. And this is something central to accounting, which is organizing of a public corporation where owners are separate from managers who control. And the thinking in this framework is that shareholders are residual claimants because everybody else gets paid contractually. Okay, management is paid by owners, their contingent performance, but the money that they are getting paid comes from residual control. In ESG, they introduced new stakeholders. Who are these? Well, they are future generations. What are their claims? Are these claims against the firm or are they against society and government? Are these claims verifiable? This is the problem. Who arbitrates these claims? So from a responsibility accounting framework, this ESG creates a lot of problems for us to create accountability. So what are stakeholders' objectives and who decides what these objectives are? Measurement then becomes an end in itself because we are measuring something with imaginary objectives. What this does is opens the door for rent seeking and greenwashing. Okay. So this leads us to the next aspect. Well, if managers are greenwashing, why don't investors change behavior? So it leads to this notion of impact investing, that if investors pick green firms or good firms, they lower their cost of capital. And if they divest from dirty firms, they raise their cost of capital. And this would change how companies behave. Well, the economics is the opposite, because when you invest in good firms, you raise their stock price. Given the same cash flows, your expected returns actually go down. So Burke and Van Spinberg actually looked at cost of capital, and what they find is impact investing has no effect on the cost of capital. What they instead recommend is investors should use their voice to change corporate actions. Well, does that matter? Apparently, it doesn't. A recent working paper shows that socially responsible investment funds do not change any firm behavior. In fact, they just pick firms which have higher scores on social responsibility. Okay? So regulators have to step in. Well, the SEC has come in and says that we are going to make firms disclose their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. One of the commissioners, Hester Pierce, came out and argued vehemently against it. Why? Because we already have rules that cover risk disclosures. There is no materiality or a distorted sense of materiality with these disclosures, which will result in non-comparable, inconsistent, and unreliable information. And the SEC ignores the cost of compliance, which would require accountants, engineers, lawyers, all being involved in measurement. Ultimately, this rule hurts investors. So my view is, one is climate change is not a risk. We know climate change is happening. It can't be a risk. The risk comes from regulatory policy. So the risk to Chevron and Mobil is whether the government will revoke their leases on drilling on federal lands. That's the risk. So the risk disclosure is from regulator. And the uncertainty is coming from technological innovation. We don't know what technology is going to look like several years from now. So from an accounting perspective, we have the fraud triangle. To evaluate what's the risk of fraud in a company, well, we can use the same fraud triangle to look at ESG fraud risk in companies. Okay? The first is opportunity, lots of opportunity. All the costs and benefits which are unverifiable happen in the future. So we can claim whatever measures we want. There are lots of incentives. Assets under management for these socially responsible index funds is increasing. Consulting fees by consultants, compensation for managers, so lots of incentives. And the rationalization, who can ever argue against it's good for humanity, the planet, or civilization? So fraud likelihood is super high. You have greenwashing by managers, impact washing by investors, and tokenism, measure for the sake of measuring. So to end, after all this, what do I want to leave? Yes, ESG may be good, but as accountants, we need to evaluate for what it is, not what it intends to do. Meantime, let's not sacrifice animals. Thank you.